Beats. And the Beats are people who are saying, we don't like, they are the predecessors to hippies. They come up with their own language. You ever use the word that's cool? You ever say that's cool? Cool was developed by the Beats. The Beats wanted to have their own language. So they say, I'm smooth, Daddy. She's a cool cat. Right? And all this kind of crap. And they would go and instead of clap, they would snap. So they had these poets, and they would go into these dens, and they would smoke cigarettes, and they would have all these weird poems, and they always wanted to make no sense. So there's a snail and a razor. Look at the sky. What am I doing? Right? And so they would do things like that, and everybody would go. Right? They were counterculture. They became the hippies. Later, they started doing acid. So my argument is, though, that this all comes about because of this new way of looking at the world. Right? We don't want wars anymore. We don't want the lives of our parents. We don't want having to deal with donkeys and chickens. Right? We're going to college. We're intellectuals. Okay. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit because I threw this in because this is one of those things that you absolutely have to know for the AP test. They're going to ask you some court cases. First, is there any fridge in there with water? All right.
Isn't that the guy that supposedly killed Martin Luther King?
What?
Right there.
No.
It looks just like him.
All white people look like you?
She's African.
All old white people. She's African?
Yeah.
Isn't there a problem with African? That's like a continent.
Someone told me that
Thank you so much.
African. She's supposed to go with African.
Do you?
Yeah.
So here's what I want to do. I'm going to go through and I'm going to tell you about each one of these cases. You can just jot down a few things about them. And I'm going to go back and tell you what collectively is significant about them. Okay? First, we have to see Justice Earl Warren up there in the right. And it's referred to as the Warren Court. Because he was the Chief Justice, and under his leadership, a number of really important decisions were made. And I have a few of them here that I think you should know. So let me tell you about each of them. You can jot down a few things if you want. Anybody know Miranda v. Arizona? Okay, what happened?
This guy kidnapped this lady, and he got arrested, and they didn't read his Miranda rights.
Okay.
And they let him go.
Yeah, he raped her and killed her.
Oh.
And killed her boyfriend. And then stole their car. He was later captured, and his rights were not read to him. But that wasn't anything that they had to do anyway. He confessed to having committed the crimes, and later in this court case, it was determined that he should have been told that he had the right not to incriminate himself.
Did you say why he did it though?
No. Okay? So he committed a crime, he was taken to jail, he admitted he did it, and then later the court said, nope, that doesn't count, you have to release him because he should have been told what his rights were, and he would not have confessed. Number two, Gideon v. Wainwright.
How did the people react to that? I'm sorry, how did the people react to that? They just let a...
Let's come back to that, okay? So, Mr. Gideon here committed armed robbery. He was arrested. He was too poor to have representation, so he did not have a lawyer. He had to try to defend himself. The big problem with that was that he was illiterate, so he had no idea what he was reading in the legal briefs or any of those things. He was found guilty, and later, when he appealed it and it went to the Supreme Court, they decided that the trial was unfair, that he had to be released because he did not have fair representation, that we need to have lawyers provided for people who cannot afford them. In Mapp versus Ohio, an informant told the police Mrs. Mapp was part of a group that was selling illicit drugs. They got a warrant to search Mrs. Mapp's house for drugs and drug paraphernalia and any evidence that she was involved in a drug ring. When they searched her house, they found pornography and child pornography in a trunk under her bed. They arrested her for having those pornographic materials and convicted her. On appeal to the Supreme Court said because the warrant was not specific to those things, that the search and seizure of those items was illegal and Mrs. Mapp was free to go. Illegal search and seizure. Please tell me I do not have to go over the Brown v. Board case. Have you heard of it before?
Yes.
So a little girl wants to go to school in Topeka, Kansas. They say she can't go to that school. She goes anyway. She's thrown out. The families, a number of them, this is what we call a class action suit because there were tons of families involved in this one. They chose the word Brown for a very good reason. So, did you know that? You heard that? Okay. All right, and so they said, no longer can you keep this little girl out of the school in Topeka, Kansas. Yates versus United States. Mrs. Yates was a communist, and at the time of her arrest, it was illegal to be a communist in the United States. She appealed it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, nope, you cannot convict her for being a communist because being a communist is not illegal. It should not be illegal. You guys know Tinker v. Des Moines? What was it?
Black armbands.
Black armbands. Okay, can you...
Oh, one of the students was supposedly beaten on her. And so, I think
There were four of them.
okay,
There's four students.
and they wanted to wear black armbands in like a silent protest. And the school wouldn't let them, and so they went to court. And they won.
That's right. The principal suspended them, out of school suspension. They then took them to court. They sued the school district, and it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said symbolic speech is protected. The last one is fairly complicated. It resulted in a rule we call one man, one vote. I don't think I have time. How much time? What is this over? 10 more minutes?
What about one vote? It's right here.
10:04.
That's it.
Sorry? 30 minutes? Okay. I'm going to skip Baker v. Carr. It's just so convoluted. Crap. All right. So, I can't skip it. So, what does North Carolina look like? Like this.
Kind of long.
This looks like a bird. All right. So, in North Carolina, they split North Carolina up into what are called districts. And it's in those districts that you vote. Prior to Baker v. Carr, the state legislatures could draw these lines any way that they wanted to. And they drew them so that when African Americans would go vote, it really didn't count. In other words, let's say this was a high concentration of African Americans, they would just split it up so that they were just taking a little bit, so that if there were any African American candidates or any candidates that were sympathetic to issues that had to do with African Americans, they could never win. Right? So Baker v. Carr essentially said district lines have to be drawn in such a way that everybody's votes counts. I would contend, if you were in my AP government class, that that doesn't ever work. Right? That the reason Mel Watt and Sue Myrick can never be defeated is because district lines are drawn horribly. One side note, don't ever register as a Republican or a Democrat. Always register independent because that's the only way we can get true democracy. If you register as a Democrat or Republican, that means the State Assembly of North Carolina knows where you are, and they can draw lines so that Republicans and Democrats in those districts always win. Okay? If you register as independent, they have no idea how to do it. Which means we go back to democracy. Yay, Jefferson. Alright. Okay, that's my little sidelight here. Alright, so I'm going to start with this example that's not here. Let's imagine the day after September 11th, you come to school and there's a kid wearing a t-shirt that says Osama bin Laden rules. I'm glad he did it.
So that would be killed. Probably get shot. He probably get beat up. Maybe claim through.
Okay,
It's-
so
he can do it.
he can do it. Why?
I mean, freedom of speech. It's free, yeah.
Freedom of speech. But now let's throw some things in there. You just immediately said he's going to get beat up. He's going to get.
Yeah, it's gonna
I
happen.
mean, he has a right to wear the shirt.
Why?
Well,
But what about if it's really offensive to everybody else in the school?
it's still.
What about this is one person and they come in with a turban on and they like have a fake beard or something, everything, and they come.
You can't wear.
Well,
Claim will be going to his house.
don't be so technical. Are you gonna be a lawyer? All right. So look. So the question becomes, right? If everybody else doesn't want them to do it, what's the they just did it today? Not even after 9/11.
Well, it's a public school. They pay for it, so they have to, everyone has to be allowed to come here. Does that make sense?
Right. But let's say everybody else doesn't like it.
Let's
Let's say we voted. Let's say the kid comes in and Mr. Parker gets on and says, "Hey, everybody, I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about, what we're going to do is we got on time, on target. I just want you to be there. I want you to do it right. I want you to do the right thing and everything in East McWhirter High School." So, don't tell him because I've got a great impersonation. I can walk like
What
a
if he was just
Pay very close
prepared
attention.
when?
Right? So I know everything's
That's
going.
awesome.
Eat McWhirter.
That's awesome.
So look, listen. Let's say Mr. Parker decided that we were going to vote and see if the kid could wear the shirt. Is that fair? And everybody voted that he couldn't, and so Mr. Parker said, "Take it off." Because we voted. That's democracy.
Yeah, but it's not.
That's good?
Yeah, it isn't the law, and we don't have a rule here that we get a vote going.
Isn't there a rule that if you come to school, you have a certain,
Yeah, schools probably try to suspend some of those technical things. Just think about the issue in and of itself. This individual does this.
okay, so if we beat him up, do we get in trouble?
Yeah. Yeah, you get in trouble.
Then, that's not, I guess.
Here's what happens in the 50s and 60s, and it's because of the Warren Court and these decisions. Okay? Let's go back to what you said about Miranda. Miranda gets off. He admitted he did the crimes. He did the crimes. He gets off. The reaction is not good. By the way, there are still plenty of law professors. There's one, Larry Sabato Jr., he is a law professor and an author, and he teaches at University of Virginia, and he says we need to get rid of Miranda because there's no reason for it. There are a lot of people that didn't like it at all.
Like the Boston Marathon thing, after his rights were read to him, he didn't say anything, but he was.
Here's the thing that the Warren Court really establishes through all of these cases. Let me use Brown v. Board.
Can you finish that one? How did
I'll go back to it, I promise. Listen, here's the thing about Brown v. Board. In Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a Davidson professor, I saw a talk on this a few years back, and he said he'd done extensive research. He had a lot of evidence about what happened in Winston-Salem. In Winston-Salem, after World War II, the African American community and the white community literally got together in town halls and meetings and said, "Okay, we don't want to be integrated because that doesn't work. So let's split up the town. And we'll use the train lines as a way to split us in half because everybody needs to use the trains." They said, these will be black neighborhoods, these will be white neighborhoods. The white people didn't do it, blacks did it as well. Everybody came together and said, let's split it up. And let's make rules that say blacks can't move into white neighborhoods, whites cannot move into black neighborhoods. We'll have separate parks, separate schools, everything. They wanted it that way because it was easier to exist. Right? What I'm trying to get across to you is that when we look back at the Civil Rights Movement, we assume that all African Americans wanted integration. There were lots of African Americans that said, we don't want integration. I don't want to be around white people. It's too much of a pain in the ass. Okay? I'm not interested in this. Okay? So this little girl who wants to go to school in Topeka, Kansas at the other school, and her family say, we want to go to the white school. If the entire community, if it's Winston-Salem, she says, I want to go to the white school, and say, no, we have rules that say you can't go to the school. What the Warren Court's trying to establish is that one girl has just as much right as all people do collectively. These decisions suggest to us that even if Miranda did commit the crimes, Mr. Miranda is protected from the arbitrary use of rules. We can't just throw out the rules and say, we know he did it, so we're going to execute it. Forget all the rules. We won't worry about those in this case. Well, if you don't worry about them in this case, that means no case matters. If one African-American girl wants to go to school, look, after the decision, it wasn't as if Topeka, Kansas changed completely. No, there were just a few families who did it. They were the only ones that wanted to. The point is, every individual, no matter who they are, deserves the same rights. If a kid comes to school with a shirt that says, I like Osama bin Laden, he will probably have to take it off. But not because he's not allowed to for speech reasons, for safety reasons. Schools are a little bit different. But if he's walking around in the community, if he's just walking down Independence Boulevard and he's wearing that shirt, people might not like it. But he's an individual. He is protected by the Constitution. Every individual is. If you want to wear black armbands, if you want to vote, if you want to go to this school, the cops can't just come into your house just because they think something's going on. Right? And start searching around. That's arbitrary law. That's like a monarchy.
So all these court cases...
All the court cases emphasize the idea that every individual has rights and is protected by the Constitution. Every individual. No matter who they are. Right? Mr. Gideon committed armed robbery. But he had to have an attorney provided for him. He was illiterate. It doesn't mean that he's not going to be found guilty. Perhaps he would have been. But we can't just suspend the rules because we don't like one person. These people, the Boston bombing people, they have got to go through the courts in the same way that everybody else does. Now, there's some question as to whether or not they get fair trials and things like that. Yeah, I mean, I don't see how you can have a jury who's going to sit there knowing what the case is that's going to be impartial. That's my only problem. But it is the case that juries are educated pretty well by the courts as to how they're supposed to look at it. Not as those individuals, they have to look at evidence to determine whether or not there's criminality. There is the case that there are thousands of people serving sentences in our jails that didn't commit crimes that we've now found out there's DNA of it. We're going off the point.
Stop making... No,
All right. So let's talk about civil rights. So I like to think about the civil rights movement as really two separate movements. That's sort of how I like to put it together. Because it was. I mean, historically it was two separate movements. Do you know what I mean when I say it was two separate movements?
There's like an aggressive one and a peaceful.
Very good. There's an aggressive one and there's a peaceful one. That's actually a really nice way to put it.
No, because MLK, he was fairly aggressive and like we shouldn't beat people up.
Not MLK, that's the wrong one.
MLK
was civil
Yeah,
disobedience.
that one.
Right. Martin Luther King was about civil disobedience. The duality of the civil rights movement is kind of easy to see. Okay? Now let's just think about Martin Luther King right? And I like to juxtapose him with Malcolm X, but you can do any. You can do Bobby Seale, who started the Black Panthers. Anybody like that. There's some clear differences between them, and I want to tell you what those are. And by the way, if you get a question on civil rights, this would be a nice little argument to put together for the AP. Martin Luther King is Southern, religious. Right? He's a minister. Right? He is in his 50s. And he espouses the idea of civil disobedience. Civil, not aggressiveness. Malcolm X, Bobby Seale, who started the Black Panthers, they both grew up, do you know? Northern cities. They are Northerners. They grew up in cities. Martin Luther King grew up in Podunk, Georgia, right? And moved to Atlanta, right? Atlanta was fairly small back then, but not really small. But he grew up in southern towns and cities. These are young people. They are Northerners who have grown up in big cities. Although Malcolm X converts to Islam, right? Bobby Seale and the Black Panthers and other radical young African Americans were not religious, right? And they believe in aggressive behavior.
That's like the...
Right? One of the more famous interviews of Malcolm X, he says, if a dog chases me, I will kill that dog. Right? And if the man holding the dog chases me, I will kill that man. Right? It's actually a really funny, you can see it on YouTube, and the older white man who's doing the interview shudders just a bit after he says it. It's fairly powerful. Right? I mean, there's a clear difference. But it's confusing. Now think about it this way. Why would Northern African Americans, young people, who didn't live in the segregated South, be so much more aggressive than a Southerner, like Martin Luther King, who grew up in the midst of racism, discrimination, prejudice?
Yeah, we just read that English this morning.
What's that?
Have you read part like Booker T. Washington's Atlanta speech about like the cotton industry and
Martin Luther King is very similar to a Booker T. Washington.
Yeah.
So what is it then?
it was like an intro speech to the northern white, and then he came down for like the cotton exposition
Right.
and about the southern economy.
Why is it that, but I guess what I'm asking is why, it seems to me, if we were just thinking logically, it would seem that those should be reversed. That the northern, younger people who hadn't had as much experience in the South would be less aggressive than the southerner who grew up in the midst of segregation and racism.
Exactly, because they didn't grow up with all the violence and everything.
But it was the opposite. Why?
But isn't it, okay, well,
Because
when
when
you're in a
you're-
situation, you learn to cope with the situation, so you learn to not deal with, I remember I was reading the book, and Martin Luther King asked his mom, like, Mom, why can't we go into the store through the front door or something like that? And she was like, that's just not the right way, you need to go through the back. Since you grew up in that, you're used to it, I guess you're not going to be as aggressive. But being in the north, the hustle and the bustle, you're aggressive as is, like New Yorkers.
I forgot to put one other aspect as you were talking about it. I'm glad what you said, I'll come back to it. The difference between the Southern movement and Northern movement, a lot of those guys, Bobby Seale, who started the Black Panther movement, he was college educated. A lot of the Southerners who were involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is what Martin Luther King started, were not. No. Not college educated. He did. I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about most of the movement. But the Black Panthers were college students. The Black Panther Party, as it was like a college club. Right? It seems really strange, doesn't it? Can we put it into this context, though, and it makes more sense? say about younger people? How had their view, what's that?
You're given more freedom.
Yep. They're interested in freedom. Remember, the 50s is the beginning of counterculture. It's the beginning of saying, we're not going to go live the life that others have lived. They're educated. They've been to college. They've read slave diaries. Right? Maybe they haven't lived it, but they intellectually have a connection to it. Right?
I don't know, it makes sense to me that you're going to be more
Aggressive.
It actually makes sense to me, and for people growing up in the South and seeing all the hatred and everything, would want to just be like, that's just not the right way to go.
Well, think about it. I mean, when we see protests today, who's out there? Younger people. I mean, it's become sort of the way that it is. Younger people in this country, after this, the ripple effect of this Cold War and everything, are saying change, progress, freedom, liberty. We want these things. Not that it wasn't said before, but that's the way it was. Martin Luther King's message is about change and progress, but it is about coming together. I mean, in his most famous speech, I think for me, the most powerful line when he says, I want my kids to be playing on a playground with white kids. He's talking about a kind of world where we don't see color as a barrier. Right? He's saying we want to philosophically and peacefully break that down. Whereas young people are saying, white people won't change. This is the way that they've been. This is what the history says. This is the way they behave. If they act aggressively, you act back. The only way to counter aggression is with aggression. Right? It's a strange phenomenon. Right? But it's what I like to think about when I think about it. Now, filling in some of the things. I'm assuming you know a lot of these. You know about the Little Rock Nine. You know about the I Have a Dream speech and stuff like that, right?
I don't know what Little Rock is.
But the Little Rock Nine is these 9 kids wanted to go to a school after Brown v. Board. The school was saying you can't come, and the military escorted them to their school.
Just kidding,
Yeah. And one of those kids was Julian Bond, who is now the president of the NAACP. Good. So the civil rights movement does not happen easily, nor does it happen quickly. The Freedom Riders, and that's one of the things I like to use as an example of what we mean by young versus old, northern versus southern. The Freedom Riders were northerners who got on buses and went into the South. They were young people. Martin Luther King never went on a freedom ride, ever. Never. The march from Selma to Montgomery, Martin Luther King wasn't there. John Lewis was. John Lewis was here last year, right? This year. John Lewis was the person standing in front. If you go watch the film, they're standing in a line.
That's a long one.
And we were down there last year. I went with
Yeah, I
Mr.
went
Ross.
there.
Did you go this year? Right, so the Selma Pettus Bridge, you guys went across it?
Yeah, it stinks.
Right, when you get to the other side, that's where John Lewis was standing in front when they started to attack. Where the little...
museum is?
Yeah, yeah. So, right, so it wasn't easy, obviously, those transitions began to happen. But the Civil Rights Movement is I think, for African Americans, an important event, not just because it brought about equal rights for African Americans, but it's also the spark for thinking about equal rights in all other aspects of American society. Women, gays, Native Americans, this idea that we need to think about others as having equal rights. How much time do I have? 6 minutes. Okay.
Who's that?
Who?
The way she...
This is Gloria Steinem. She started the National Organization for Women. This is Jimi Hendrix. He's hot. This is my favorite hippie right there. And just think, you know, if there's anything that says hippie, it's this dude. You know, the hair and the hand and the, you know, shirt. Right. So it looks like I'm gonna have to come back. Yeah, we got a lot. Alright, so I'm gonna have to do another day anyway. Any questions about anything we've covered today? Yeah.
Did the people in the 1950s and 60s like foresee the environmental impacts we have?
The environmental thing really starts with Rachel Carlson, who writes a book called Silent Spring. And that book, I believe, was late 40s or early 50s, and that book was the first to sort of make this pronouncement that we need to think about environmentalism. But you got to remember Theodore Roosevelt and the creation of the national park system. The conservationist movement was before that. And Gifford Pinchot, who was the